Many policemen and dispatchers will tell you they've seen and heard everything. But what about the paranormal? Police officers are regarded as amongst the most credible of eyewitnesses, but if they encounter anything out of the ordinary that could be considered paranormal, they choose to stay silent, fearing they may be ridiculed. The following are true stories about police and paranormal encounters, where in some cases they have come across cases that go way beyond what would be a normal day on the job. The screaming teen. The following case was reported by dispatch worker Meredith Shearman, who received a 911 call from a family reporting that their teenage daughter was possessed. They said that she was not on drugs and had no history of mental health issues. Although Meredith was extremely skeptical about the call, she continued to listen. As family members were holding the teenager down, the dispatcher could hear two people screaming at each other in the background. So she asked the caller to tell whoever was yelling to stop. The caller said, "It's her." The dispatcher said, "Well, I know it's her, but whoever was yelling at her at the same time to stop." The caller responded by saying, "It's her, both voices." Meredith Shearman said it was the creepiest thing she'd ever heard, and she'd been doing the job for 25 years and had heard many things. I know people do horrible things to each other, but this was a different kind of evil. She could clearly hear a young girl screaming while at the same time an adult male was yelling back. She said she could not understand either language, but there were clearly two different voices. The family swore that both voices were coming from her at the same time. It made the dispatcher's skin crawl. A lieutenant listened to the tape later, and he looked at her and said, "Do you ever wonder?" Yes, I do," said Meredith. The phantom prisoner. One evening, police officer Marco Costello brought in a man for domestic violence who was loud and aggressive. As he was processing the man, he checked cell number 1 and saw a man with a short haircut, white t-shirt and glasses. He did not pay the prisoner much attention, fearing he could start causing trouble and start making demands. After processing the aggressive male, the officer proceeded to walk him to his cell, and as he was passing cell 1, he noticed the prisoner in the cell was just standing there, not moving or saying a word. After placing the recent arrival in his cell, he went about his business. Later that evening, the sergeant asked him to check the paperwork of the prisoners to see if they were ready to be transferred to the county jail. As he picked up the paperwork and prepared to do a head count, he looked into cell 1 and found it was empty. He panicked and immediately told his sergeant, who in turn called detectives to see if they had either moved or released the man. The detectives said they'd had no contact with the prisoner, so Officer Costello then checked the computer and paperwork again and found the head count was accurate. However, he could see that nobody had been placed into cell 1. Both he and the sergeant went to the dispatch office to check the surveillance footage video where they had initially booked the man. After rewinding the video, they could plainly see him booking the prisoner. They then fast-forward the tape to where it shows them walking out of the cell. But as they're walking past the door of cell 1, the prisoner appears to blink out of existence. Everyone was totally freaked out by what they'd just seen. Looking for answers, they then tried transferring the video to a DVD and USB drive, but the prisoner in the cell did not appear. As they were reviewing the video, they could see prisoners in other cells talking to someone in the direction of cell number 1, even though everything shows it being empty. After that frightening event, Officer Costello was wary of going into booking alone. The haunted lock. Detective Rob McGinley responded to a suicide where a male had hung himself in the tree in the backyard. They attempted to inspect the house but found it was locked with a deadbolt on both sides of the door. Detective McGinley called for entry tools and a supervisor for a breach because the deceased man's girlfriend had not been accounted for and they lived together and were concerned about a possible murder-suicide. Several patrol officers in McGinley were standing at the back door of the house, which had been checked multiple times, waiting on entry tools. McGinley looked at the door and saw that there was a gap in the frame, and looking through could see that the door was now unlocked. He checked the door and found that it was now open. They cleared the residence and found there was nobody inside. They even checked the attic. Inside the door that had somehow unlocked itself were multiple notes to family members from the deceased. They walked outside and waited for further assistance and tried to walk back inside, but the door was locked again with a deadbolt. It should be noted that nobody had any keys, even though there were key locks on both sides of the door. The detectives were discussing how they were going to call for entry tools, then found the door was again unlocked. Nobody was brave enough to go near it. Detective McGinley again had the residence cleared and found there was nobody inside. Detective McGinley and the lead detective did not go back into the house that day. Mysterious phone calls. Dispatcher Dalton Hostetler had been receiving calls for assistance twice a week for about a week. The problem was that the calls had been coming from a vacant house. The voice on the phone sounded like an elderly lady with dementia, and she was barely audible. She kept repeating over and over, please help, whilst continually coughing, but she was totally unresponsive when they tried to communicate with her. His shift sergeant made some inquiries about the house and found that the property was definitely vacant, and the last residents that were there were a daughter who had looked after a mother who was dying from stage 2 lung cancer. The dispatcher was totally freaked out, realising that he'd been communicating with the deceased person. The knocking. One cold winter night around 3 a.m. in the morning, Officer Troy Peterson was parked in the dark, completing some paperwork behind a Kmart store. All of a sudden, someone or something started banging on his driver's side window, and they did it 2 or 3 times, which scared the hell out of the officer, but he claimed that it often happened. However, on this occasion when he looked up, he found nobody there. He looked around and could not work out who could have done it because he had an 8-foot wall on his right and a 10-foot fence on his left, and the car was surrounded by open space both front and back. It had been snowing, and as he got out of the car, all he could see were his own tyre tracks, but definitely no footprints. There were no marks left on the window that could have shown where the knocks had come from, and no signs of a snowball being thrown at the window. He even looked under the car but found nothing. From that moment, he was always anxious when returning to that location.